December 6, 1942. RAF Chelmsford, England. The early morning air was crisp, tinged with frost, and the faint hum of engines warming up. On the tarmac, dozens of B-17 flying fortresses stood like metallic giants, their olive-drab fuselages glinting in the pale light. Crews were completing last-minute checks, meticulously going over instruments, guns, and bomb loads. Among them was Second Lieutenant Curtis LeMay, a young pilot with sharp eyes and nerves honed by months of training. He had been briefed countless times on the threat posed by Luftwaffe fighters, but today, he would put a new theory into practice: the combat box formation. The combat box was more than a tactical diagram on paper. It was LeMay's answer to a deadly problem: how to survive against waves of German fighters with nothing but the defensive firepower of his own aircraft and those around him. Bomber crews had learned the hard way that scattering in the face of enemy attack was a death sentence. Planes that fell out of formation were almost always picked off immediately, victims of precise German tactics and the deadly effectiveness of flak and cannon fire. LeMay walked along the line of his aircraft, nodding to gunners adjusting sights on their .50 caliber machine guns, checking that ammunition belts were loaded, and observing bombardiers practicing their sighting drills. Staff Sergeant Harold Monroe Graham, a ball turret gunner assigned to LeMay's unit, adjusted his headset and peered through the small glass turret beneath the aircraft. At 22 years old, Graham already had 27 missions under his belt. The night before, he had written a letter home. "We all know what we're facing tomorrow. Schweinfurt is the toughest target in Germany. But the formation will protect us as much as anything can. If we stay together, if we hold the box no matter what happens, some of us will make it through." It was a sentiment shared by every man climbing into the bombers that morning, a mixture of courage, calculation, and the grim understanding that survival depended on discipline, teamwork, and sheer luck. The B-17 itself was a marvel of engineering. Its four Wright R-1820 engines could push the heavy bomber to over 300 miles per hour, and its 13.50 caliber machine guns provided overlapping fields of fire in every direction. In theory, a well-coordinated formation could create a defensive lattice so dense that attacking fighters risked their lives just to get within firing range. LeMay's innovation was arranging these planes in a three-dimensional pattern, so that every bomber was covered by the guns of its neighbors. The combat box was born of meticulous calculation. Angles of fire, spacing, and timing had to be perfect. As the bombers rolled onto the runway, Luftwaffe pilots over northern Germany were already scanning the skies. Experienced German fighter commanders had learned to exploit any weakness in formation. They attacked in waves, focusing on isolated aircraft and using WWII rockets from hundreds of yards out. They understood that a scattered bomber was an easy kill. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 would dive from above or slice through the gaps in the formation, while flak batteries on the ground rained deadly shrapnel into the sky. The first mission using LeMay's formation was a revelation. German pilots approached in coordinated groups, expecting to break up the stream with terror and fire. But the concentrated fields of overlapping machine gun fire turned the skies above Schweinfurt into a deadly gauntlet. Fighters were forced to break off or were destroyed outright. The few B-17s that did fall out were quickly swarmed, confirming the necessity of maintaining strict formation discipline. Technical Sergeant Albert Brown, a radio operator, later wrote home about that first flight. "You see a bomber fall out, and you know he's done for. The fighters swarm him like sharks around blood. But if you stay in the box, if you hold your position, the others protect you, and you protect them. It's the only way we survive." The combat box did not eliminate casualties, but it gave crews a fighting chance. Over the next year, LeMay's formation would be tested over the industrial heart of Germany. During missions targeting factories and ball-bearing plants, bombers flying in these boxes endured waves of Luftwaffe attacks, often losing dozens of aircraft per mission. The 305th Bomb Group, flying in the most exposed low-group positions, suffered particularly. On a single raid over Schweinfurt, 13 aircraft failed to return. Hundreds of men were killed, captured, or missing, yet those who maintained formation had significantly higher chances of survival. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe refined its own tactics. German pilots learned to strike in small, overwhelming numbers, timing attacks for maximum disruption. But even the most experienced pilots found the dense, overlapping fire from hundreds of machine guns unnerving. It was one thing to attack a scattered bomber. It was another entirely to punch through a moving, coordinated wall of fire while dodging explosive shells from below. As 1943 progressed, the importance of the combat box was amplified by technological advancements. The arrival of long-range P-51 Mustangs equipped with Merlin engines changed the game. These fighters could escort bombers deep into Germany, neutralizing the Luftwaffe's previous advantage. Combined with the disciplined defensive formations of the B-17, the strategic balance shifted. By early 1944, deep penetration missions were no longer suicidal gambles but increasingly survivable operations. Through it all, the personal stories of the young men who flew these missions illuminate the human cost. They climbed into bombers at dawn, often straight from farms, small towns, or cities across America. Many were barely out of their teens. They faced freezing temperatures at 30,000 feet, flak bursts, and fighter attacks for hours at a time. They carried letters, prayers, and charms to ward off the ever-present specter of death. They relied on each other and the rigid geometry of the combat box to survive. By the end of the war, the combat box had become the defining formation of American heavy bombers. It had enabled thousands of missions, dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on German industrial targets, and contributed decisively to the attrition of the Luftwaffe. Yet beyond its tactical genius, the formation symbolized something more: the extraordinary courage, discipline, and ingenuity of a generation willing to face unimaginable odds for a greater cause. The frost of December had long passed, and by October 14, 1943, the men of the 8th Air Force faced one of the most harrowing missions in the entire war, the second raid on Schweinfurt, Germany, later immortalized as Black Thursday. The target was critical: the ball-bearing factories that powered much of Germany's war machine. Without these bearings, tanks, aircraft, and trucks would grind to a halt. The strategic importance was undeniable, but so was the risk. The 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses that took off that morning carried more than bombs. They carried the lives of nearly 3,000 young Americans. For many, the mission would be their last. Staff Sergeant Harold Monroe Graham, who had already flown 27 missions, climbed into the ball turret of his aircraft, his fingers brushing over the cold steel of the machine guns. He knew the odds. In his letter home, preserved by his family, he had written about Schweinfurt as the toughest target in Germany, yet he still clung to hope. The formation gives us a chance. If we stay together, if we hold the box, some of us will make it through. The B-17s lifted off in tight formation, ascending through the mist over England. Each aircraft carried 7,500 rounds for its 13.50 caliber guns. The formation, an intricate, three-dimensional lattice of 54 planes in the wing box configuration, was designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire, a literal cage of bullets that could rip through approaching fighters. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German pilots, flying Bf-109s and Fw-190s, were operating from airfields within 50 miles of the bomber routes, allowing for rapid sorties. They had refined their tactics over the preceding year. Small, focused groups of fighters would dive in at precise angles to disrupt formations, then pull back, refuel, rearm, and strike again. They aimed to scatter the bombers, for once out of formation, a B-17 was almost defenseless. The first waves of attack came over the Netherlands and Western Germany. Rockets, cannon fire, and machine guns ripped through the sky. Engines shuddered under flak bursts, and bombers veered to avoid collisions, but the combat box held. The principle was simple yet brutally effective: scatter and die, hold formation and fight back. Yet the losses were staggering. By the time the formations reached Schweinfurt, 28 bombers had already been destroyed. The 305th Bomb Group, Lamy's old unit, flying in the low group positions, suffered the brunt. 13 aircraft failed to return, leaving 130 men killed, captured, or missing. Entire crews disappeared into the smoke and fire, their parachutes a fleeting glimpse of survival. Harold Graham's plane was among them, struck repeatedly, engulfed in flames, spinning out of control. Only 3 parachutes were seen leaving his bomber. He was gone, 22 years old, one of thousands of young men confronting death in the skies over Germany. Despite the chaos, the bombing was devastatingly accurate. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs revealed shattered production lines, destroyed ball-bearing plants, and smoldering factories. But the cost had been catastrophic. 60 bombers shot down, 17 returned so damaged they were scrapped, and 121 more limped home with significant damage. Over 650 crew members were casualties, 22% of all men who flew that day. At that rate, completing a 25-mission tour was nearly impossible. The lesson was clear. Discipline and formation were survival. Bombers that maintained their positions had a 50% chance of returning, those that fell out, almost none. Each aircraft carried 13 machine guns arranged to cover every angle, nose, tail, dorsal, ventral, and waist positions. Together, a 54-plane combat wing fielded over 700 guns, a continuous wall of bullets stretching in 3 dimensions. German pilots learned quickly that an attack on a tightly held formation was a gamble with a high probability of death. Amid the losses, personal courage shone. Technical Sergeant Albert Brown, radio operator with the 305th, later wrote, "The formation is everything. You depend on each other absolutely. That's what gets you through. Knowing you're not alone, that if you do your job and stay in position, the formation will protect you as much as anything can in this war." After Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force made a hard but necessary decision. Deep penetration raids without fighter escort were too costly. Operations were restricted to targets within the range of long-range fighters until the North American P-51 Mustang could be deployed en masse. With the P-51B, fitted with Packard-built Merlin engines and external drop tanks, the Allies now had fighters capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. These Mustangs could match or exceed the performance of Luftwaffe Bf-109s and FW-190s at 30,000 feet, fundamentally shifting the balance of air power. By early 1944, missions returned to Schweinfurt with P-51 escort. B-17G Flying Fortresses, bristling with 13 machine guns, flew tighter and more compact formations, concentrating firepower while maximizing bombing accuracy. The Luftwaffe, suffering from unsustainable losses and the attrition of veteran pilots, began to collapse. Experienced German fighter pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced, and the attritional strategy of the Allies was paying off. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied air forces had achieved air supremacy over Europe. Losses plummeted from the staggering 20% per mission seen in 1943 to 3 to 5% by mid-1944. Young American crews, once facing almost certain death over central Germany, could now complete 25 mission tours with a real chance of survival. The combat box, born of necessity on a frosty morning in Chelmsford, had proven its worth both tactically and psychologically. Yet it was not just about formations and machines. It was about the men. Ordinary Americans, average age 23, many from farms and small towns, ascending into icy, flak-laden skies, relying on one another for survival, carrying the weight of strategy, freedom, and the hopes of millions below. They were tested not just in combat skill but in courage, endurance, and trust in their formation, their crews, and in the machine they flew. The combat box became more than a formation. It was a lifeline, a weapon, and a testament to American ingenuity, industrial might, and organizational skill. Each overlapping gun, each precise spacing, each calculated angle of approach represented hours of planning, analysis, and sacrifice. For those who flew and survived, the memory of Black Thursday and the men who did not return became part of the legacy they carried home, a legacy of bravery, resilience, and unyielding determination in the face of unimaginable odds. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force had internalized the hard lessons of 1943. Each mission over Germany was no longer just a bombing run, it was a carefully choreographed ballet of firepower, endurance, and precision. The combat box, once a theoretical formation tested over Charleston, had now been honed through thousands of missions and hundreds of airmen's sacrifices. Every plane had a role, every gunner had a line of fire that interlocked with those around him. For the men in the 305th Bomb Group, each mission began hours before sunrise. Pilots and co-pilots reviewed navigational charts, plotted fuel consumption down to the last gallon, and coordinated altitude changes to maintain formation integrity. Bombardiers recalibrated Norden bomb sites repeatedly, knowing that even a slight deviation at 25,000 feet could scatter bombs far from their intended industrial targets. Gunners cleaned barrels, checked ammunition belts, and practiced drills, all while the chill of pre-dawn England seeped through flight suits and leather jackets. Crew members like Staff Sergeant James, Jimmy, Harlow, a ball turret gunner, described the terrifying calm before takeoff. You look at your plane, you're home for the next 10 hours, and you think about the boys who didn't come back yesterday. You strap in, and for a moment you feel invincible, until you realize how fragile it all is. For Harlow, the combat box wasn't just a tactical formation, it was a lifeline. He knew that a single misstep, a single plane falling out of position, could spell disaster for the entire group. The Luftwaffe, for its part, was relentless in its adaptation. German pilots studied photographs, interrogated downed crews when possible, and refined their interception techniques. They knew that attacking the tight American formations head-on was suicidal. Overlapping fields of fire from the B-17's 13 machine guns could decimate an uncoordinated attack. Instead, Luftwaffe pilots developed coordinated high-speed assault, often diving from 30,000 feet at angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire. They employed WWII-21 rockets and cannon fire to break the cohesion of the boxes, focusing on stragglers and isolated bombers. One account from Feldwebel Kurt Weber, a German fighter pilot stationed near Cologne, highlights this evolution. Weber described a formation where the B-17s seemed to move as one beast. Their gunners were everywhere. You couldn't just pick a target, you had to calculate where the bullets would cross your path, and by the time you adjusted, you were already being hit. German pilots learned to conserve ammunition, retreat, rearm, and strike again, sometimes attacking the same bomber stream multiple times. Yet despite their skill, the relentless industrial output and training of American crews gradually tilted the scales. Technical innovations on the American side also made a decisive difference. The B-17G Flying Fortress, with its 13 defensive guns, 7,500 rounds per aircraft, and rugged airframe, could absorb multiple hits and remain airworthy. Crews learned to use altitude, tight formation, and overlapping fire to their advantage. Radio operators like Technical Sergeant Albert Brown coordinated communications between tail gunners, waist gunners, and the pilot, ensuring that every angle of attack was covered. These men became experts in anticipating enemy maneuvers, predicting German dive angles, and adjusting their defensive fire in split-second increments. By February 1944, when the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt and other high-value targets, a new variable had entered the equation: the long-range P-51 Mustang. With its Packard-built Merlin engine, extended drop tanks, and combat radius exceeding 650 miles, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany. American crews, previously vulnerable during the most dangerous segments of the flight, now had fighter support that could engage enemy aircraft before they reached the box. Bomber formations still held their positions, but the psychological boost of knowing friendly fighters patrolled the skies made an immeasurable difference. Yet even with escorts, missions remained perilous. Crews recounted seeing flaming B-17s spiraling toward the ground, parachutes drifting against the bleak European landscape, and the constant presence of flak bursts that could punch through wings, fuselage, and engines in an instant. Each mission tested the limits of human endurance: 10 hours of near-freezing temperatures, oxygen-deprived lungs, and the constant threat of sudden death. The tactical and technical mastery of the combat box, combined with long-range escort, began to exact a devastating toll on the Luftwaffe. Experienced German pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced, and their aircraft production could not keep pace with attrition. By the summer of 1944, Allied air power had established near-complete dominance over the skies of Western Europe. Bomber losses dropped dramatically, survival rates increased, and the once daunting industrial targets in central Germany were now vulnerable to precision strikes. Personal stories continued to illuminate the human side of these campaigns. Crew members wrote letters, kept diaries, and later shared memoirs describing fear, camaraderie, and the small rituals that sustained them: lucky charms, pre-flight prayers, and notes to be mailed home in the event of death. These narratives underscored the stark reality: in the fight for air supremacy, skill and tactics were only part of survival. Courage, discipline, and mutual dependence within the formation often determined life or death. The combat box had become more than a formation; it was a symbol of American ingenuity, organizational mastery, and the extraordinary bravery of young men confronting the deadliest skies in history. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, Allied air forces had ensured that German fighters could no longer threaten the strategic bombing campaign or the invasion itself. The careful combination of technology, tactics, and human resilience had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. As 1944 progressed, the combat box reached its full maturity. Crews flying missions over Germany had become experts in maintaining tight formations, anticipating German attack vectors, and using every ounce of their aircraft's defensive firepower. The B-17G, now a proven workhorse, withstood flak bursts that tore through wings and fuselages, engines that smoked yet still delivered altitude and speed, and fighter attacks designed to overwhelm even the most disciplined crews. Each aircraft's 13 guns created a near-impenetrable shield of fire, overlapping with the guns of neighboring bombers, forming what veterans often called a cocoon of lead. Crew members like Lieutenant Tommy Gallagher, a bombardier with the 306 Bomb Group, described the scene over Leipzig in March 1944. "You could see tracers everywhere, black puffs of flak, and smoke rising from planes hit ahead of you. You cling to your Norden bomb site, release your load, and then just pray the formation holds. If someone drops out, the whole dynamic changes. It's terrifying, but it's also strangely beautiful in a deadly sort of way. The planes move as one, like a single organism, defending itself with every gun." The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, struggled to counter these increasingly sophisticated American tactics. German commanders experimented with massed fighter formations, head-on attacks, and even ramming tactics in desperation. Pilots were forced to fly multiple sorties in a single day, often returning to rearm and refuel within minutes, and yet the growing dominance of American long-range escorts began to neutralize their efforts. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, some of whom had survived the initial onslaughts in 1943, were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. By late 1944, the attrition of skilled German aviators had reached a tipping point, leaving less experienced pilots to face the disciplined, heavily armed bomber formations. Technical details of the aircraft became decisive. The P-51 Mustang's arrival on the front lines allowed bomber formations to extend their operational reach. Mustangs flew ahead of the formations, scouting for Luftwaffe fighters, engaging them before they could close in, and providing cover all the way to deep targets like Berlin and the Ruhr Valley. The combination of the Mustang's speed, maneuverability, and extended range meant that bombers were no longer completely reliant on their defensive guns alone. They now had active, lethal support. Amid the tactical and technological evolution, personal stories continued to illustrate the human cost and bravery inherent in the campaign. Radio operators, gunners, navigators, and pilots wrote letters that revealed their thoughts, fears, and hopes. Corporal Edward "Eddie" Rains, a tail gunner with the 303rd Bomb Group, later recalled, "When a fighter dives on you, your heart stops. You fire, you duck, you pray, but you also trust the guys on your left, right, above, and below. The formation is your life. Without it, you're just another target. By late 1944 and early 1945, the 8th Air Force had achieved a level of air supremacy that was unthinkable just 2 years prior. The Luftwaffe could no longer mount effective large-scale opposition. The combination of the combat box, long-range fighter escorts, and relentless American industrial production ensured that bombing missions could proceed with dramatically reduced losses. Aircraft that had once been prone to catastrophic failure under attack now returned home despite multiple hits, testimony to both the ruggedness of the B-17 and the effectiveness of disciplined formation flying. The cumulative statistics of the strategic bombing campaign highlight the combat box's effectiveness. Of the more than 12,000 B-17s deployed in Europe, nearly 5,000 were lost to combat, but analysis revealed that those who maintained formation discipline had a significantly higher chance of survival. Individual bombers that fell out of formation faced almost certain destruction. Those who held their positions had better than a 50% chance of returning. Entire airmen's lives, in essence, were determined by their ability to stay in the box and trust their comrades. The psychological and organizational impact of these missions cannot be overstated. Young men, many barely out of their teens, flew repeated sorties knowing the odds of survival. Yet the camaraderie within the formation, the sense of purpose, and the knowledge that their efforts were critical to ending the war sustained them. Letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs paint a vivid picture of the resilience, ingenuity, and sheer courage of these crews. By May 1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close, the combat box had not only fulfilled its tactical purpose but had become a symbol of American air power. It embodied industrial might, meticulous planning, technological innovation, and human courage. Factories, rail networks, and oil refineries across Germany had been decimated. The Luftwaffe had been forced into a war of attrition it could not win. The men who flew these missions, average age 23, had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare, proving that with the right combination of training, tactics, and equipment, daylight precision bombing could succeed even against the most determined opposition. The legacy of the combat box endured long after the last B-17 returned home. It represented a uniquely American approach to warfare, one that combined engineering, organizational skill, and human bravery. It was not just a formation, it was a lifeline, a weapon, and a testament to what ordinary men could achieve when called upon to perform extraordinary acts. And perhaps most importantly, it was proof that in the darkest skies over Hitler's Europe, courage, discipline, and unity could prevail.